you said, comes from survival. It's not to be judged, but to examine and to continue to work on. One of the things that is even more complicated, for good and for bad, I don't really know where it situates itself. But so when you bring in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean Black Latino, that is like a, not even a triple or a quadruple, it's like a octet threat. Like it's kind of awesome because it's so rich and complicated. But I don't know where that sits. I mean, one day there's a lady who does hair in Southwest Detroit, and they call her La Negra. That's so positive and beautiful. It's acknowledging her dark skin, but only certain people can say it. Certain people can't say it. She needs to know you. You can't be a stranger, you know. And so I walk into this environment, and I'm like, I don't know, miss. Like, I don't know what to call you. I don't really quite know you. And then I was calling her by last name, and when I got to know her, she was like, why aren't you calling me by my name? And I was like, I just don't know, you know. And I think that there's a lot for immigrants, a lot of code switching and language switching and survival work that's happening. But, and we talked about this at a different panel, we need to be okay with it, but we also need to work within it and acknowledge that it's a silo that we cannot control, but still forge those partnerships, because I get chills. I always say we need to be better partners, and we need to be at the front line with Black people. My friend tells me, I'm not an African American. I'm not from Africa. I'm Black. And so I love saying that. I was like, okay, you know, let's talk about it and be with it. And she's like, what do I call you? I'm like, I don't know. Hispanic, Latina, call me by my first name. But how do we forge the partnerships and the deep relationships despite the silos? Like, you know, maybe we need to keep the silos, but find a different way to connect and not make them so much wrong, but to create roots that go around them. I don't know. So it's a really interesting dialogue, and I feel like I'm in it weekly with all the groups I'm working with, and I'm sure, you know, that, I mean, it's a question we need to ask. You know, where are we aligned and why? Is it survival? Is it language? Is it, you know, I mean, it comes down to, and I think we're about to move into one of the questions, but it comes down to language and clothing, and, you know, just every day I'm reminded of my own privilege, and I'm so grateful of that. You know, like, I have to acknowledge when I have access and continue to understand the work that we do with the ones that don't, you know. And so I think from that point, we'll move into, unless you want, is there any additional? Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that maybe we didn't highlight was also, I think the burden of survival really is the burden of the first generation of immigrants. And so you're 1.5 generation, second generation.
Second.
As am I. You're probably 1.5.
And just clearly, like, later. And to, like, define that, like, I was born in England. So what does that mean? So 1.5 generation, does that mean I'm even a first generation? Or am I just a straight immigrant? Like, I don't really know.
There's questions related to that. But I think that as second generation folks, as people who don't have to struggle as much with English as a second language, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and sit with, yes, that was their decision to utilize, like, aligning with whiteness as a form of survival. But what is our responsibility operating this space of second generation immigrants or 1.5 generation immigrants who have the language? Because how do you talk about racial equity or the intersection of race and immigration in a language that you barely even know, right? Like, I can't talk to my parents about that. They don't, it's two different languages. So what responsibility do we have to walk with our first generation elders to help them move through that process, while also acknowledging that, yes, as an Asian American, I receive levels of privilege because of the hierarchy of race in this country that allows me access to certain places that doesn't allow Black people. And how am I verbally acknowledging that, and how am I actively working to dismantle those systems of power and oppression? And so it's a lot of work, I think, for second-generation immigrants, but it's work that we have to do.
You know, just to respond to that, I think at an organizing level, when I go out into the community and I see Indians who are not Muslim, who I say join the Take on Hate campaign, and they say, why? We don't give a damn about that. That doesn't affect us. I have to put in the context of it may not affect you, you directly from your perspective, but to someone else who sees you as an outsider, who just sees you just by color, you are the other to them.
Right.
And it will be the same way, for example, if I'm going to be organizing an African American or a Black Caribbean, who I'm trying to make them join me against violence perpetrated by the police against Black people, against African Americans. And if they're saying that issue doesn't affect me, I'm not African American, I would use the same sort of thing. That in a flash instant, you are still going to be judged the same way when a police officer may see you. And unless you get actively involved, either by sharing your story and sharing your unique identity, or against the issue, no one will know. You are lumped together into these huge groups that it's a fact, or right now we're being discriminated against. It's documented. You can be their ally, or you cannot be their ally. But either way, if you stay silent, you will be lumped into that group.
I just wanted to highlight also the responsibility of the even subsequent generations. So, because my great-grandfather came from Sicily and ascended because that category of whiteness was expanded. So initially Catholics and Irish and Italians and Eastern European Jews, not everyone was included in that category of whiteness. And so over time that category expanded. And something interesting actually at this conference, there was another speaker, Ian Haney Lopez, who talks about what might happen in the future and how in the future how the category of whiteness might change and who might be accepted into being considered white. Someone with light skin who has a higher education level, and so that's an interesting thing to keep in mind about how aligning with whiteness, who can be included in that, can change over time. And so when I talk to my family about immigration and welcoming immigrants, a lot of times, and I grew up in Macomb County, so most of my family lives here, and a lot of times that is completely tinged with the black-white binary, and they don't see themselves as descendants of immigrants as the same as immigrants who are coming today. And a lot of that is based on their perceptions of immigrants who are coming today have a darker skin color. So that conversation has to continue. And we try to highlight how, when they first came, they really were ostracized, couldn't speak Italian. And we're trying to, Catholics weren't allowed to hold certain positions and that kind of thing. So again, it's not the same experience, but teasing out a little bit of that can help open doors there for understanding and building that empathy for what newcomers today are experiencing.
Well, that's why I think that race and immigration is conflated, right? Because it is about, well, people are coming here and they look differently, and so it's this sort of delineation. And I can tell from some of the conversations that, we're all having them, but I was in a meeting recently, and we were talking about 100 years ago, Detroit was 60%-ish immigrants. And we had been in a different meeting where that came up, the statistics. She's got a great PowerPoint. You should send it to me. And somebody asked the question, what happened to the immigrants? Did they go away? And I was like, no, they're you. You're 3 generations. You're 4 generations. Yeah, I was like, you're 4 generations in. And I think that maybe where the delineation maybe internally for people of color is, no matter how many generations in you are, you're still an immigrant. And because there's, if you're lucky enough, you're constantly speaking another language to somebody, or there's a food that's, you're still eating that, that your family makes, or depending on how far, you've come into, second, third generation. Because I get asked a lot. I was born in Texas. I'm a citizen. You're not an immigrant. Why do you work on these issues? And I'm like, they're my neighbors. My dad was an immigrant, kind of. It's such a weird story, but I won't. He was a reverse immigrant. He was born in the U.S. and raised in Mexico. So, it's all over. And I think, then I think there's even an A and a B sort of section. For example, there's the Mexican American or Latino American from different countries, second, third, first generation. Then there's an immigrant who has come, and they also have like a first generation, or maybe their son or daughter has come, or their mother is here. So there's a first generation, second generation arrival. So you're dealing with even, for example, some recent arrivals who are Americanized and feel American, and there's some Mexican Americans, resident citizens, who don't feel like they belong in the U.S. And I can't even begin to describe. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally, yeah.
There's the American, family that's ethnic or minority, or and they could be 4 generations in. And there's so many layers of who's going to school, and you should be here by now, and and I've had lots of conversations in my neighborhood from different Latinos asking me why we work with undocumented people. Why do you work with undocumented people? Why are you doing this work? I don't understand. I don't relate. And I'm pretty speechless most of the time when it happens, but just so that I won't curse at them. But and so I'm wondering, what are your experiences, for example, recent arrivals who might have intergenerational, several generations versus, the American citizens also of the same ethnicity, but also have intergenerational layers. How is that working out in your work? How does that play out in your work? Oh yeah, no, all of everything.
I think, to speak kind of to what you were saying, I think that from everything that we're kind of trying to say and everything everyone's kind of said, it's a privilege to be able to pick, if you're an immigrant, whether or not you identify with being an immigrant or not. And it seems that that really follows along whether or not you can pass as being white or not, so it's color, whether or not you speak English or not, so it's language. And it also really runs heavily with socioeconomic status, so your class. So and your religion, if you come from the Middle East or if you come from South Asia. So if you're Muslim, then it's like nowadays you can't really assimilate. So that then affects assimilation. Back in the day before 9/11, I totally assimilated, and I assimilated as being a middle to high class, white, wealthy Ann Arbor person. My family did, because we were, even though I was darker, I spoke English, and we were of higher socioeconomic class. But because my family practiced Islam after 9/11, we were treated in ways that were discriminatory that we were not prior to 9/11. We were treated in ways as if we were not American that we were not previously. And I think, though, that was a privilege, the fact that we were able to choose whether or not we were white or not, in terms of fitting in, or if we were black or not. That was a privilege that a lot of people don't have. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. That's a privilege that a lot of immigrants have. That's a privilege that you don't have, though, I think, if you're an immigrant, really regardless, if you're an immigrant and you're lower socioeconomic class. That's something that I believe, for a fact. You're going to be discriminated against in ways that you usually can't prevent. But I think that one way that, I think that to kind of talk to what Theresa was saying about background and give you guys context, the reason why I really became interested in social identity and the intersection of multiple identities that people have, so that means like race, religion, socioeconomic class, color of skin, all these different things, how do they all intersect to give you this choice, is because I come from a family where, my sister is part white. She married into an Armenian family. My grandmother's Burmese. My grandfather's Sikh, and he, fought in World War II. He was captured by the Japanese. I mean, my dad's Muslim. He married my mom, who's Hindu, and she was a higher caste. She's very light. Everyone on my mom's side of the family is Hindu, light, and they're kind of discriminatory. Everyone on my dad's side of the family is Muslim and dark, and me and my brother are the two dark ones. So I became very aware at a young age of me and my brother being very aware of race, and my sister Natasha being very light and not having to identify with certain things or be aware of certain issues. She also had a name Natasha, so I mean that helped her, And so that was something that I became really aware of. And like, how come she doesn't have to get these questions? How come she doesn't have to, after 9/11, how come people didn't call her? How come she didn't get stopped at the airport and I did? And so all of these things, I think, made me really interested in how does our identities kind of shape the privilege we have in choosing who we get to kind of affiliate with, and sometimes not giving us that choice. But then in the terms of organizing work, and what Theresa's organization does, which is so important, is that how do we really communicate to all immigrants that this stuff, even if it's not directly affecting you, it will affect you in the end, to make them politically active. Because, I come across all the time what you were talking about, different sort of immigrants. They may have immigrated a couple years ago, or they may have been born here, and they're like, we don't think these issues are important. Like, shut up. Like, we don't care. Stop talking about how Asians aren't represented in the Capitol, the legislature. We don't care. And I'm like, well, bottom line is we are, a huge group. We're really fast growing in the state. You get these people elected, you pay their salaries, and they're voting certain ways on issues that, in the end, are hurting you, and they're going to hurt your kids. And they're like, oh, okay, we'll go to these events. But we don't really consider ourselves Asians. Asians are East Asians. And it's like you really have to make a story of us, make a story of why certain things that are happening right now are, I don't know, the story of us. You guys know about all that, like the story of we, story of us, how it really does affect everyone. I don't know. It's been interesting, I think, from a personal level, and from looking at what's going on in society right now. How do you link those two? I think that's the real challenge.
Somewhat similar, but a different community experience is happening in Macomb County with the Iraqi community. So right now, Iraqi immigrants and refugees constitute by far the largest foreign-born population in Macomb County. The Asian communities, and there's several, are definitely growing, but in terms of sheer numbers, the Iraqi community is huge, and it's grown a lot over the past 10 years. And what's interesting is the previous generations that chose to come here as immigrants have a very different experience than the more recent arrivals that are coming as refugees. And so, just in case people don't know, that fact of immigration status can have an impact on how people are received. So, immigrants might save their money and they might learn English before they come. They may or may not, but there's a different attitude and mentality before you arrive. Refugees, not always, but at least with this current population, tend to be lower income, less educated, didn't plan or have as many resources, before they came, and so we're seeing how they're treated in the community differently. And the previous generation might look down on the most recent arrivals, and then on the part of white U.S.-born residents, we work a lot with local governments, partnering with them to help improve their welcoming policies and practices, which we'll get to in a moment. But a lot of times the cities will get complaints from residents saying, my Muslim terrorist neighbor, XYZ, didn't plant their flowers in the right place, or didn't plant flowers, actually. That's the bigger concern sometimes. These calls come in, their garbage cans weren't in the right place, and often the reality is the refugees are actually most often Christian. They could pass for white, but in the eyes of the white community members, they're automatically seen as other, they're automatically assumed to be Muslim, and even though some of the other Iraqi communities family members, they just don't, they're not expecting that because I look lighter, and they think that they wouldn't be perceived that way by the U.S. foreign resident. But so just to tie into that different experience of generations of immigrants and how that can play out.
Well, I'm going to give my thought, and then we're going to move to a wrap-up with everyone, and then questions from the audience. But I just think about the second generation, first generation, how hard they work, and how the guilt, the guilt that the second generation has, and how I've seen it sort of like really sort of divert. You're either going to say, yes, you're right, I should go to school and overdo it like I did, because that was my access point was, I'm going to go to school because I'm good at this, right? And that feeling never goes away. I mean, just, I mean, we've got great business owners in Southwest Detroit, and they're constantly still, what else could I do? Just this non-fitting in or being the other. Or people rebel, and there's all the in-between, and I just think it's really complicated explaining sometimes as I'm in the community talking to parents who are ready to disown children. I'm like, no, this is the American thing, I think. Be patient. But we're going to wrap up, and I think one of the things that is just really affects my work is because I just put these out as samples on the table. I go out, these are actually translated, this is an English one, but people will ask me, if they're so industrious, right, because sometimes I have to speak for all immigrants in Southwest Detroit. Why do you need to do this? And I think about the access, there's a lot of successful people, and that becomes like a mask. I don't need anything. Don't talk to me. I don't need any help. I'm good. And then when you start to have these deep conversations, they say, I didn't pay my taxes last year, or my son is sick, and these things come out. And I'm really grateful for the opportunities that we have to engage. And I am really rich because of it, and we just canvassed for any ideas, and I'm really proud of the work that this team did. We took English applications, translated them, passed them out, talked to business owners, translated them back into English, and the idea of the supremacy of white culture is like, we need to clean these up and they have to be perfect. I'm like, no, we're going to submit them the way they are, because they need to understand how they're not going to reach people if they don't translate, they don't have relationships. And so I felt like it was, I don't know, not an act of rebellion, but I wanted for them to acknowledge the multiple layers and steps that they have to take if they really want to engage. And I want one day to not have a job, that they won't need me as the intermediary and translator, that I will need to occupy that space. But hopefully not too soon. But so any last thoughts?
Well, also just to say, your organization has you guys have produced great materials kind of summarizing the economic sort of like, I guess, benefits that immigrants have given to the state of Michigan, and how they contribute, and how many of them actually come here holding higher degrees, that I've passed out to people who have been like, we don't need all those immigrants, and all the immigrants, all they do is they come here and they take our jobs and this. And there was like this one that I remember using, and I passed out to like various people, and they were like, oh, I had no idea. So that information I think is great.
I can post it to your Facebook.
Yeah.
It shows.
It's great stuff to even show immigrants. Like I've shown Indians that, and they're like, oh, we had no idea. So,
yeah. I can't spot the statistics off the top of my head, but it's like,
I might have it somewhere.
Do you have it?
Well, I don't have all of them, but foreign-born residents in Michigan are 3 times as likely to start a business, and the national average is 2 times as likely. So,
and then like stay in Michigan after they graduate.
They're more likely to stay in Michigan after they graduate, and so our Michigan immigrants are more entrepreneurial than even other states.
And like create jobs for Michiganders, and a bunch of statistics that kind of blows that.
And a new study just came out recently that showed for every immigrant that the United States welcomes, each immigrant will create 1.2 jobs. So that might look like starting a small store or restaurant, hiring other people from the community. It might be a high-tech firm, so it varies in terms of what the business is. Before we move on, I did want to highlight though some of the policy
I think
things. Are we going to talk about policy? Can you do it in
maybe like a minute and a half?
Yeah, just briefly. So, because Macomb County is a welcoming county, and Sterling Heights has signed on as a welcoming city, Clinton Township has signed on as a welcoming township. That sounds great, right? But there's actually a commitment that all of those localities are working on in terms of operationalizing what does welcoming immigrants mean in our communities. And a big part of that is around instituting policy change. So for some of the biggest ones are language access. In some communities, there's a high percentage of limited English proficient individuals, so language access is huge. It's also, you need it just to be current with the civil rights law, but whatever. It also it helps people access basic services in the cities and counties, so we're looking forward to that coming out. The county has been changing their hiring practices and looking at speaking another language not as a detriment, but as a benefit or an asset for a certain position, especially in areas where employees engage with the community, since we have so many community members now that speak other languages. They also have been working on, well, collectively we've been working on making sure that open board seats and commission seats are shared to immigrant and ethnic community members, so that folks are actually participating in the fabric of community life. So not sort of siloed into this is the ethnic community, but actually on the planning commission, on the arts and beautification committee, or in all aspects. So. I'll stop there, but if you want more information, we can talk after.
So I think often when we talk about immigrants, so the last conversation had me a little bit uncomfortable, because I think we tend to talk about like immigrants are good because this is the economic contribution that they can make to our communities. But what that does is that kind of masks the challenges that a lot of our immigrant communities are also facing. And I think they often can be collective stories that connect us to Black communities, right? So needing to like work within our communities, having this collectivist culture, really counting on family, etc. But I think it gets lost when we talk so much about this economic contribution, and then we hear Black communities being angry, like they're setting up all these businesses and shops in our community when we're having a hard time getting access to microloans, etc., to start our business. And so I think although there's truth to the entrepreneurial spirit of immigrants, there's also a conversation that needs to be had about how we also connect with other communities of color, the receiving communities, to make sure that we're honoring the history, the survival of people who are here in this space before us, and making sure that we're educating ourselves about the history and the dynamics, etc.
And one local politician that we worked with, when we were discussing that, and we said, as a collective project, you should also be highlighting, the business, your other small businesses, for example, barbershops in the African American community, and they really were flabbergasted and said, we can't think of any African American owned businesses, which was completely untrue. I'm not going to name the locality, but they had a large African American community in Macomb County. So a lot of it is education in terms of working with residents and community leaders to kind of bring everyone together, but just wanted to put that story out there because that happened.
Well, thank you. now we are going to see if the audience have any questions for the panelists.